What is the economic impact if we were to accelerate research on women's health?
Since 1995, over 50,000 articles have been published on the human brain, shedding light on the most complex organ in the human body. But of those 50,000 articles, less than half of 1% focus on health factors specific to women.
When we think about women's health, we need to think beyond the reproductive organs.
Women are more likely to be sent home from an emergency department while having a heart attack than men, and they are more likely to die in the first year after a heart attack. How is it possible that we do not have the knowledge, diagnosis, and treatments to save the lives of women?
You know, we rely on science to solve our biggest problems. Why would you want to even risk shutting out the ideas of half of your population to solve those problems?
Exclusion of any group in clinical research holds back the health and wealth of our society.
Women's health needs innovation and creativity. It needs everybody to look at it in a new way.
It shouldn't be 30 more years, but it should be 3 years.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Carolee Lee, CEO and founder of WHAM, Women's Health Access Matters, a not-for-profit focused on accelerating research and investment in the health of women. Women make up 51% of the population, 85% of all spending decisions, and 80% of healthcare decisions for their families. Yet they remain drastically underrepresented in health research and in investment. I'm pleased to be here with you today with our esteemed leaders in this field and to share our newly released WHAM Report, the business case for accelerating women's health investment. It was developed in collaboration with KPMG. And this report spotlights the enormous opportunity that's in a sector that's poised for tremendous growth. It reveals how capitalizing on sex-based differences can drive profitability, fuel innovation, and create a competitive advantage for investors and companies. But to seize this opportunity, we need to be clear. Women's health is not limited to reproductive care. It extends far beyond. It includes every disease and condition that disproportionately or differently affects women. That's autoimmune disease at 80% women, Alzheimer's disease, that's 2/3 women, and depression, twice as likely to affect women as men. This is not a niche market. This is the future of healthcare. We must recognize that men and women are biologically different, from our genes to our cells to our organ systems. And the more researchers and clinicians look, the more they find that these differences are not just significant, they're actionable. That's why this is such an immense and profitable opportunity. This isn't just about health, it's about market inefficiencies waiting to be solved. The next big frontier in healthcare is investing in solutions that serve 51% of the population more effectively. That's why we launched the WHAM Investment Collaborative, a first-of-its-kind partnership of multi-billion-dollar funds committed to accelerating innovation in women's health. This bold initiative is a cornerstone of our 3 Not 30 campaign to dramatically increase investment in women's health research and innovation over the next 3 years. It's not just about closing the funding gap. It's unlocking one of the most under-recognized and transformative sectors in healthcare. So I ask you this, why is this market opportunity still unrecognized? Why is this need still unmet? And why does only 2% of healthcare investment go to companies focused on the health of women? Well, one answer is the myths and misconceptions that we still hold. And today, our extraordinary panel will begin to debunk those myths for you. At the same time, we've seen real momentum. In the last 5 years alone, there have been 35 successful exits in women's health, including 4 IPOs, 31 mergers or acquisitions, proving the sector's viability and strong returns. And the market is growing, projected to reach $66 billion by 2033. WHAM is focused on providing clear and actionable data so that we shift minds, behavior, and create the impact that benefits us all. Investing in women's health isn't just an ethical decision, it's a smart, scalable business decision. The data is clear, the opportunity is massive, and the time to act is now. Today, you will hear from 4 remarkable leaders in women's health investment, representing perspectives from venture capital, investment banking, translational science, and private equity, several of whom are also members of the WHAM Investment Collaborative. They'll illuminate the unmet need, and I know they'll convince you that this is a business opportunity in which we all need to be involved. So let's dive in. And to start off, Christina, I wonder if you could please briefly introduce yourself and share a bit about your background and your current role. And also maybe focus on what myths do you think investors have about women's health, and how can we challenge those common misconceptions?
So, hi, everybody. I am absolutely thrilled to be here today with everyone, and I really appreciate the invitation from WHAM and Carol Lee, who have been really important, critical partners for Lightstone Ventures now for well over a year. And we're very proud to say that we are amongst the early adopters of the investment collaborative alongside these great panelists here today, and we're colleagues and friends. So a little bit of background. I'm trained as a neuroscientist, been in the biotech industry now for 20 years across a number of roles that includes venture creation roles. I've been part of founding teams for biotech companies. I've operated in those companies, typically in a corporate development, business development capacity, and joined a firm called Lightstone Ventures 4 years ago, and I'm currently a partner in the firm, leading the biotech efforts on behalf of the firm. We are an early stage investor, typically work in the seed to Series A range, but also have flexibility to support Series Bs onward. We invest in biotech. About 2/3 of our portfolio is biotech, and then also the medical device side, which is about 1/3. And we are located in Boston. We're also located in Portola Valley in California. And we also have an office in Dublin, Ireland. So we're very much a global firm who's investing both in the US, Europe, and also have legacy investments and venture creation efforts that went on in Singapore for many, many years. So we have a good insights into what goes on in Asia and have invested there as well. In terms of women's health and why women's health. So this has been actually an area of interest for us for a while. We historically, we have legacy investments in companies like Gynesonics, more recently in companies like Willow, which is the hands-free breast pump. As we expand the definition of women's health and think about autoimmune diseases, we're investors in Nimbus Therapeutics, very much focused in immunology. And very recently made an investment in the urological space with a medical device, a company called Amber Therapeutics, which is focused solely on the treatment for women. That was a very successful Series A raise, well over $100 million with a great syndicate of investors. So we're quite focused on this area of opportunity. As Carol Lee mentioned, these are large TAM opportunities, large market opportunities. And as an investor, I will tell you that I have viewed my personal role to, first of all, support our companies to truly understand who the target patient population is for each of the therapeutics they're developing, whether it's a medical device or a drug. And oftentimes we will find that females are a big part of those opportunities. And if you think about it, as venture capitalists, I think we can all say we've seen many, many pitches. It is very common that we don't hear about the patient first and foremost in those pitches. So whether you're male, female, usually we are not hearing directly about the patients. So first and foremost, as a venture capitalist, we can support our companies to make sure when they're storytelling, start with who the patient is. And it comes to disease areas where women are a predominant part of the market opportunity, that should be highlighted and called out. So I view my role as a board member is to ask the question of how we're integrating sex biology in our preclinical research, how we're incorporating that in our clinical research, how we're understanding that in the market opportunity. And for new pitches that are coming our way, I can tell you that we are very consistently now and deliberately asking the question about how the role of sex as a biological measurement is being incorporated into their plans. We are finding better and better answers, but I will say there's a learning curve. And whether the CEO is a male or a female, it doesn't matter. I will tell you folks that the answers are pretty weak in terms of how they're incorporating sex biology. So that's our role as investors, is to make sure those questions are being asked. And our role as investors is now to wake up to the new definition of women's health and understand that many of the areas we all find very, very interesting, like autoimmune, cardiovascular, neurology, psychiatry, we should wake up and realize that females are a predominant part of the opportunity.
Yeah, well, thank you, Christina. I know we've talked about these issues, and you've explained how you're trying to incorporate the questions so that you, or the guidelines, so that you're trying to get more of the companies to focus on the sex as a biological variable as an opportunity. So I think that's fantastic. Nina, you've been, I don't want to say a pioneer, but certainly very early in supporting companies focused on the health of women. And I wonder if you could do the same and tell us a little bit about, how and why, a little bit about your background, which I know is very interesting. And what areas of women's health do you think have the strongest momentum for investment growth right now?
Well, thanks, Carolee. And I definitely want to also echo Christina's comments of appreciation for being included here. And just so heartening that more and more attention is being turned to women's health and women's health investment, even though our statistics are still so deplorably poor, with 2 to 3% of last year's dollars going to women's health, a small fraction of all the healthcare dollars invested by venture and early stage PE. My passion for women's health, I think, goes back to my early days as a peer health educator in high school around sexual and reproductive health, which carried through to university, where I focused some extra side gigs on sexual and reproductive health education, as well as eating disorder prevention in the student health population. And I helped pay for college by working in a medical practice that was an OBGYN, very, very enlightened leading practice that was doing a lot in the menopause space, including clinical trials. So I worked on the early bisphosphonates in osteoporosis, even as an undergrad. And then I went on to the Kaiser Family Foundation, which is a research think tank, but they have a very significant dedication to sexual and reproductive health and reproductive justice. So that continued an energy. And then in my 25-year investment career, starting at a hedge fund, and then last really 20 years in 2 different venture firms, Interwest and Canaan, both of them diversified firms investing in both technology and life science. We've had investments in the women's health space, whether that's in conditions that solely affect women, a significant number of investments in breast cancer, for example, or ones that disproportionately affect women, whether that's migraine or depression as areas. And I think we can talk a little bit about those areas. And we were co-investors with Christina and team in Gynesonics as well, which happily was acquired last year. It was a long journey to get there, but ultimately a good outcome. When I reflect on some particular investments, there's quite a bit of momentum. When I was at Interwest, I had an investment in one of the very first menstrual tracking apps, which had 15 million downloads and 3 to 4 million active monthly users, which was sort of staggering statistics for 15, 16 years ago. And that's an area that's getting actually a lot of attention again today. Or we were investors in Sarah Prognostics, which was a diagnostic to predict preterm labor that was really uplifted by the fact that there was a progesterone approval for treatment of preterm labor. So you could couple an action to a diagnostic. Or Espriva, which was one of the first companies working in lupus and lupus nephritis in particular, where we really had to dig to find women and women of color to participate in clinical trials, because there weren't a lot of clinicians that were prepared and comfortable to do that. There have just been a tremendous amount of learnings along the way. Currently at Canaan, we're investors in Antiva, which is a topical antiviral for the human papillomavirus, which is responsible for cervical cancers. And in investing in that company, and it's seeking reinvestments, also some really interesting insights about biases towards the gynecologic provider as a technology adopter or prescriber, thoughts about market size, thoughts about what's value in that market. Does it matter to women to have a non-surgical approach to HPV lesions that might preserve fertility, preserve bladder function, or is that just a nice to have that payers wouldn't pay for? So I look forward to talking about some of those challenges or barriers. What's interesting to me is that what's really hot last year was a pretty good year for women's health investment, with about $1.2 billion invested across 111 deals. If you search PitchBook for everything that's described as women's health within the healthcare venture perspective, the overwhelming majority are in service or tech-enabled service deals, things that are focused on fertility, menopause, general access, pregnancy, some mental health, menstrual tracking, as I mentioned. AI is giving a huge lift to those consumer and business apps, which is exciting. But I think it's speaking to the fact that there's much more ardent demand from the woman consumer and a better recognition of the business opportunity in service delivery than there is in diagnostics and therapeutics, which of course stand to have such a tremendous revolution in the financial and the clinical and social burdens of women's health conditions. There were some diagnostics deals, which is good. They're a little bit sequestered towards the fertility space, and that, as we know, is largely a cash pay out of pocket space. So Carolee, you've done a fabulous job with the WHAM report in highlighting that the business imperative can be a motivation for investment. And I think we need to amplify the business imperative in drug discovery, development, diagnostics to see this market really meet the moment.
Yeah, thank you, Nina, for that. We agree. We have obviously a lot of thoughts on how to do that, which hopefully we'll get to a little later in the conversation. So thanks so much for everything you do. And UPMC has been a great partner of WHAM's for a long time, and obviously plays a very pivotal role in advancing the health of women. So can you talk a little bit about your work and the work of UPMC and the power of payer and provider data to do de-risk, a lovely word, investments? I think you're muted.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Carolee, and really excited to be here with you today and to share with everyone what UPMC is doing. I'll start a little bit by just describing what UPMC is. So we are a provider, a payer, and an investment arm. We have over 40 hospitals, both within the United States, mostly focused in the Northeast, and also internationally with a hospital in Italy, Croatia, Ireland, and in China. And so we're very strong on the provider side of things. On the payer side of things, we cover over 4 million lives with our insurance plan, and that includes both commercial and government business. And then our third major pillar is the enterprises or the investment arm. And we are a $1 billion fund that operates evergreen. And what our main remit is to invest in the life-changing medicine of tomorrow. And that could either be to invest in things that will help our hospitals and our patients and members specifically, but it also extends out to improving healthcare for everyone, not just UPMC customers. And so that's the really exciting piece of what we get to do, because we have the resources and the clinical and insurance data from all of our members, but that helps us to extrapolate and really understand what's happening on a large scale outside of our own system. And so one of the ways that really helps us evaluate deals is kind of on the very beginning of the evaluation and also supporting them in the end. So when we see a new company that's doing really amazing science, one of the first things we do is we to kind of go back to what Christina was saying, you have to understand the patient and you have to understand the stakeholders that are required to make whatever that is a success. And a lot of times it's talking to physicians and asking them what they think of the solution. And it breaks my heart every time we have to pass on a women's health company, but whenever we do, it's usually because the physician tells us they're solving a problem, but it's a problem that's either not the root problem or it doesn't solve their problem. And if a physician won't adopt it, the chances of it getting to a patient are very low. On the other hand, in terms of payers, we can talk to our payer colleagues and ask them, is this something that you could feasibly pay for? Will it fit in with our actuarial algorithms? And they can give us some really good insights on whether it will or not. So we think having all of that really deep information helps us really make good decisions on what to invest in. But once we do invest in something, then we really have the resources to support that company until the very end of the story. And that might be by having our key opinion leader physicians, really holding the flag for this company and adopting it and talking about it at medical conferences and really spreading the word among expert circles. It could be having our payer be an early adopter of it and reimbursing and really proving out the ROI for the payer side of things, which that story tends to be very, it helps a company really sell their value. So whenever we invest in a company, we really want to support them from A to Z. And that's one of the things we offer is being able to connect a lot of these dots. So excited to talk more about that later.
Thanks, Anna. It's fascinating how the complexity of how you bring all of this together. So we appreciate that very much. Sasha, let me turn to you. I know that you have played a critical role in focusing on the health of women, and you have a new position at Baird, which congratulations on. What drew you originally to the sector, and what is it as institutional investors and private equity? How is it that you feel that you can scale capital to continue to drive investment in women's health?
And I want to echo again, everyone, thanks so much for Carolee and WHAM for having me. It's been an incredible partnership over the last several years, and I'm thrilled to continue that over here at Baird. Why don't I first kind of provide a quick overview of Baird and my practice, which might help share a little bit of perspective of kind of my seat at the table, which is a little bit different, I think, than some of the other panelists and quite complementary too. So I have been in the investment banking space for coming up on a decade now. Joined Baird about a month ago. Before that was at Leerink Partners and Goldman Sachs. So I've always been in a strategic advisory role supporting my clients. A lot of that has been focused on M&A at the time of actual transaction. So usually I will work with clients when they're looking to predominantly, it's been on the sell side, so sell their businesses. The majority of my clients are usually private equity and on one of their portfolio assets, though we do also work with strategics. And then a smaller part of our business is also on the buy side selectively, but ultimately I'll work with usually either later stage or kind of late growth, I might say, businesses that are looking to kind of get that exit and then hopefully get a good mark on the board for investors like Christina and others here. And so ultimately I, the last, I would say, several years started focusing on women's health as I saw, I was candidly trying to do a map of where am I seeing investment and what categories within healthcare am I seeing investment, what areas are largely unbanked, where is there actually an opportunity to create more of this flywheel? As we know, the more exits that you see, that creates another opportunity for more investment to come in at all levels of the chain from seed stage all the way through private equity, and ultimately wanted to play a front role in driving that progress. And so started that work over at Leerink and now at Baird. Was really attracted to the one P&L model of the firm. So we are a financial services institution. There's actually 5 pillars in the firm: private wealth management, asset management, fixed income, investment banking, which is where I sit, and private equity as well. And within the investment bank, there are 4 coverage groups. Again, I sit within healthcare, but we have industrials, consumer, tech and services. We're about 420 investment bankers globally. Within the US, have several offices. Largest is kind of Chicago, Milwaukee based, as well as Charlotte. I'm based in New York, where we have a growing presence as well, but also have offices in London, Frankfurt, and a few global partnerships as well. So I joined and very much was the focus of continuing the work across women's health, but expanding the practice and the scope actually quite significantly. And I think Baird's pretty uniquely positioned to do that because of our one global P&L model, which is very different for most investment banks. And so while my practice will cover a lot in healthcare services, so kind of think about four-wall fertility clinics, OBGYN clinics. A lot of that is sort of provider focused. A lot in healthcare IT, so any tech-enabled service or solution that usually will sell into employers or payers, as well as now we'll be focusing more on, in partnership with my other colleagues here, around diagnostics, around women's health, around medical devices and tools as well. And so it really is thinking about, I think Christina's comment earlier, of who is the ultimate patient or consumer that is going to be a driving force of the business model. And that will actually also include, in partnership with my consumer colleagues, who have a separate practice focused on beauty and wellness, did a lot of areas within healthcare and wellness that overlap and flow. Some of that is cash pay. Ultimately, things like focus on longevity, for example, is a great example, or supplements, food as medicine, that can kind of fall in both categories. And so I will advise companies on M&A. And as I think about the last few years, and definitely kind of probably the more last 6 months, while we for sure saw there was, I think, quite interesting momentum in the M&A landscape within private equity specifically, whereas it is where we see the largest dollars coming to play. And so as I think about end of last year, Amulet Capital, a private equity firm, acquired Genetic IVF that represents their second women's health investment. They separately own another asset, US Fertility. And so to see another well-established, extremely reputable firm double down on, again, a separate investment, I think is a very good indicator for the market. We also saw what I thought was quite a very interesting, not without its level of complexity transaction, but Astorg took Hamilton Thorne, which was previously publicly traded in the Canadian Stock Exchange, took that company private, combined that with Cook's reproductive health portfolio, and then in January of this year also acquired Fujifilm, Irving Scientific's medical practice. And so seeing kind of that combination, it was quite creative, again, complex, but it allows what were essentially three smaller firms to combine, and then you will get economies of scale, you get synergies, really able to really move the needle in a very attractive way. And that was just kind of in Q4 of last year, right? And so to think about what I've seen so far in we're coming up on the first quarter now, into the first quarter of the year. Obviously, there's been a lot of changes coming out of the administration. A lot of questions around what is kind of the economic impact, what is the recession risk. That has for sure had an impact on kind of deal flow sentiment across the private equity landscape. However, through recent conversations with private equity investors, there really is still this balance of investors have to deploy capital that they have on the balance sheet, right? But they're trying to assess quality assets. And so based on feedback that we've received so far from the investment community, there are kind of a few areas where investors are kind of uniquely either focused on or have a preference for assets that fill a few categories. And so one is, what categories are recession resistant? What assets may have kind of minimal government exposure? Of course, like the impending cuts on Medicaid are of course top of mind for a lot of these businesses and investors. And how do you mitigate that risk? Of course, anything right now that has a higher self-pay component is more in vogue. Again, just focusing how do you minimize risk from an investor's perspective, as well as we've seen a shift, a material private equity shift, which I don't think is uniquely for women's health. It's more healthcare broadly, away from purely kind of traditional provider businesses, meaning multi-site physician practice management, to more either tech-enabled solutions or payer services, or a different way to, investors are increasingly looking for ways to invest and put real capital to work within women's health that might be a different alternative to just owning clinics. So that appetite is still there as well. And ultimately, I mean, to put a little bit of, I know there's a lot of challenges, of course, but there are several quite interesting processes ongoing now in the space where we can't disclose more detail than that, but there is significant investor interest. Of course, the bid-ask spread of valuation is the million-dollar question, which I am optimistic we'll see more of a meeting of the minds this year, and do anticipate private equity to continue to play a material role within the M&A landscape and ultimately investment within women's health.
Fantastic. Continued success. That's amazing. Christina, let me come back to you on the heels of some of Sasha's comments and ask you, how do you see the exit landscape evolving for women's health startups? An area that I know all of us are very fixed on.
Yeah, I mean, so look, I think women's health aside for a second, what are strategics looking for, right? And I think this is just an important thing that an exercise we all need to do is to understand that there aren't things that are necessarily unique to women's health per se. Like some things we just need to understand more global scale wise what people are looking for. I think, in general, de-risked assets, right? So again, I know you love that word, Carol Lee. De-risked, what does that mean? Everything from, let's say, validated biology, a validated target that's been, proven to work clinically in humans, something that might have a commercial path already defined could be de-risked, something where payers are already used to paying and covering for a particular area. Now, do you have to check all these boxes? No, right? But there's a certain amount of de-risking that people are going to look for. That said, there's also been certain areas like psychiatry that have been plagued for a very long time where a lot of investors and strategics, right, were shying away because of just the additive effect of so many failures, right? And biology not translating preclinically, clinically, right? And less maybe about kind of commercial opportunity and payer context and well, I shouldn't say less about payer context, depends on the particular psychiatric condition. But we're seeing now a whole new wave and it's a whole new breath that's been given to the psychiatric area with a number of exits that we can point to just in the last 18 months, right? Based on, right, successful clinical trials, successful data points that people can point to. So it comes down to data and it comes down to having the right kind of data that matches to the opportunity, right, that one can pursue commercially. I'd like to say also the exit landscape is evolving. We all have to pay attention to actually the fact that certain pharmaceutical companies are certainly paying attention to this new definition of women's health about, diseases that affect women, diseases that affect women differently, diseases that affect women predominantly. And I think they're grasping that their interests in immunology, in neurology, in cardiovascular will ultimately link to targeting the female patient. And there are some pharmaceutical companies, so I can name two right now, Novartis and UCB Pharmaceuticals, who have made strides and actually invested their own dollars, time, and effort to target the female patient group. So one example is Novartis's Entresto for HFpEF, which is a female predominant heart failure condition, where they got Entresto approved, and to Novartis's credit, identified that the female patient was the predominant opportunity and went back and ran clinical trials where they focused on the female patient. And that added another 2 million patients to their commercial target population, which is not something to ignore, right? So it's proof right there that strategics do need to pay attention because they're leaving money on the table, right? By not studying the female patient. The other example is Cimzia from UCB, which is one of many, TNF alpha based drugs for autoimmune disease. To UCB's credit, they recognize that by pegylating their particular product, that would be a chemistry way and approach to not crossing the placental barrier. And they realized that this was an investment worth making because up to 20% of women affected with autoimmune diseases are of childbearing age. And so they are as far as I know, the only product out there right now that has that in their label, and the ability to use a TNF inhibitor in the context of a young woman who is maybe considering having a family. So there are a lot of examples where the strategics are in tune with the opportunity. I do think psychiatry points to a good example of kind of the landscape evolving. Certain companies are also now spending time and effort studying menopause and any advancements in biological understanding around menopause. And we know Astellas obviously has an approved medicine at this point for menopause. I think endometriosis is coming more and more in the context of talking with some strategics. Again, there, I think it is going to be up to smaller companies to kind of demonstrate the translation of some of the insights biologically to the clinic. But again, I think people recognize that this is a highly underserved patient population. Yes, only female in this context. And recognize that it has been kind of an unfortunate situation where nothing has become available for these patients that is really tailored to treat them. You know, it's interesting because at JP Morgan this year, I attended the healthcare conference and had a few conversations with different pharmaceutical companies. And what blew my mind, and Carolee, I know I shared this with you, was that 3 out of 4 of them brought up women's health to me before I could. And it was the new definition of women's health, which it actually, you know, it brought me so much joy. Honestly, it was probably one of the best outcomes of attending that conference this year. And it was not just inquiring or asking, but it was kind of this realization of, oh, hey, wait a minute, we're in neurology and immunology and everything. We're realizing that we're actually very much oriented to treating the female patient, and we need to start paying attention to this. And in fact, we are starting to pay attention to this. So I do have a lot of hope that the work we're doing to spread the word on how to think about the opportunities here is working. I just hope, I really hope that while there are low-hanging fruit opportunities where we can all invest, whether we're in the strategic camp or in the investor camp, we can invest in those areas. There's still a lot of science and a lot of biology that needs to be invested in and uncovered that will rely heavily on, you know, NIH and other sources of funding. And, you know, frankly, as an investor, I am concerned about the pipeline of opportunities if that funding does not continue to really, open up the opportunities of how to pursue some of these areas of biology in the clinical setting, you know, through our ability to invest. And if those areas don't continue to grow and shed light on the, you know, pathophysiology of different conditions, it's really gonna, take a toll in terms of what we can invest in as investors and then what exit opportunities might exist.
Yeah, well, thank you. It's somewhat encouraging to hear some of your commentary as well as worrisome on some scores, but we'll get to that in a minute. Nina, you have such a fantastic perspective or historical perspective of this. So you can either respond, whichever you prefer, to what Christina was just saying. And my question to you also is, how do you see venture capital interest in women's health evolving over the next 3 to 5 years? Because obviously, and how can women's health companies tap into it? Because we do have more momentum now. We do have more interest. On the other hand, we have issues with the new government. So I'd love to hear your perspective on these issues.
Thanks. Well, Christina laid things out really, really well, as did Sasha, I think, in sort of the spectrum of what's hotter and what's not in the current market, given some of the macro aspects. I think specifically to the exit markets, I probably would index a little bit more to the cynical, the cup half empty, because when I look at the specific exit transactions and even the investment momentum, there's been a lot in late stage and in life cycle expansion, reformulation, direct to consumer opportunities that I think have a good investment return on for VCs and private equity, but don't have the same societal return for true women's health because they aren't probing into the basic science, understanding the pathophysiology of conditions, looking at longitudinal data. And this is something exciting that I think that PMC is doing. And also, I hope that some of these companies that are service and tech-enabled service with strong AI and data components will also help deliver is better disease and condition understanding. But when I look at the larger transactions that exited last year and into the new year, you had Gynesonics, you had Sarah Prognostics, you had Endomag, all of them med tech, diagnostic or device companies that were not only post-pivotal trial, they were FDA approved and in market before they could seek, a strategic outcome that was attractive. You had several women's health supplement companies, direct to consumer, that I think are really trying to solve in some part for the lack of access or the lack of attention that women get when they see a traditional provider about condition management. So turning to, supplementation for fertility or for menopause symptom management, or even their autoimmune conditions. But you have, things like Wiley or Menolabs that are, almost like vitamin companies selling direct, that were among the larger outcomes. And then there's something a little bit too in the consumer demand for natural, more holistic. Honey Pot was a really nice outcome, and that's looking at more plant-based, environmentally friendly, women's hygiene and women's health products. But in that roster of good exits, there wasn't a single therapeutics deal. And the therapeutics deals and indications that are getting investment, for example, AbbVie and Pfizer's endometriosis drugs are getting repositioned into uterine fibroids or heavy menstrual bleeding, rather than looking for true novel mechanisms. There's been relatively little available. So I think there is an interest, there's attention to women's health for many different tailwinds, not the least of which attention to the market size. But also I was remiss in not sharing a little bit about Canaan. We're a 50-year-old venture firm that invests in early stage technology and life sciences. But we're kind of unique in that we have 4 women investors in our life sciences practice and 6 overall. And while that doesn't necessarily stand up a strategy in women's health, it has definitely thrown our door much more open to female founders and female CEOs who we know innovate in women's health at an 8 to 10x ratio to men, despite the fact that they raise the same amount of money for twice as many deals. So just a little footnote that male founders and CEOs still raise just as much money. In fact, their average deal size is twice as large as a female founder or female CEO. So that comes around to my hopes for venture in the next 3, 5, 10 years. We are slowly but steadily increasing the ranks of women investors and women founders who naturally are more comfortable turning their attention to these conditions. So while we need to overcome bias and educate our male peers about women's health market opportunities and physiology and condition, I think we also just need to steadily keep increasing the number of check writers and the number of founders that are around the table driving these innovations forward. So that's something that I'm really passionate about through Woven, through working with WHAM, through BIO's initiative in women's health, through supporting the Sisterhood and S2X, who are 2 groups of female CEOs and female investors, to really create community, support deal flow, and make sure that this is not just a moment, but really a movement for advancing women's health.
Yeah, perfect. And it kind of reminds me of the fact that by 2030, there'll be the largest wealth transfer that's ever taken place of $30 trillion to baby boomers. And 2 things strike me about that. It will be the first time that 66% of the wealth in this country will be owned by women. Maybe they'll become larger investors. And 80% of women change financial advisors when their husbands pass away. So the kind of information that we might be able to feed them about these kinds of opportunities could be critical. But let me switch to you, Anna. We can come back to that discussion another time and ask you, because of how UPMC works, how can payers and providers create better incentives for investment in women's health?
Absolutely. So I think that it's pretty low-hanging fruit right now. The first step to creating better incentives for more investment is really just better communication of unmet needs and desired solutions from these entities out to the market. Because I think entrepreneurs, are really excited to do things in the space, and investors are really excited to invest in it. And the main problem is the key risks that are inherent in women's health investments are, are they going to be used by providers? Are they going to help patients, and will payers pay for them? These are, the key questions that we ask every time we see an investment. And if we can de-risk these facts, it'll be a lot easier for investors to feel secure investing in these companies. And to share kind of a specific example, endometriosis was mentioned, and it is becoming more of a hot space in terms of investment and definitely entrepreneurial activity. And what we've kind of heard from our key opinion leaders within UPMC is that we definitely need an endometriosis diagnostic, but the ones, a lot of the ones being generated are ones that will, the sensitivity and specificity is looking pretty good, and it will accelerate you to getting surgery, but it's not really solving your problem of, why do you get these endometrial deposits in the first place? And so one of the key things that our physicians say is, we would like a very robust diagnostic that can help you understand subpopulations of endometriosis, because it's a very heterogeneous disease and not everyone likely has the same pathophysiology of disease. And so, we need a really robust diagnostic that helps us understand these subpopulations. So then our scientists can go find new targets and really come up with a therapeutic that can pair with this diagnostic. And so that's not something we've seen a whole lot of right now, and something that we and our physicians would like us to invest in. And so I feel like it's my duty to get this information out, because we've spent so much time talking to them, and this is what they really want to see. And so hopefully the entrepreneurs out there are listening and will have something for us to invest in soon.
I hope so. That sounds like a great plan. Sasha, if I turn to you and ask you what factors make a women's health company attractive for institutional investment, I'm sure you have some thoughts on that.
Yes, and I think where I sit, a lot of the companies I work with and institutional investors or private equity who I work with, it's on the later stage. And so, and even, in this market, there is sort of a expectation or a much higher bar for investment, and a heightened focus on just the financial profile of the business, right? And so most of the companies that I work with are EBITDA positive or kind of turning the quarter on profitability. And so there's a ton of scrutiny on unit economics, kind of managing burn, if there is any burn left into the business, or what do you have to believe to kind of get to profitability. And I think some of the big questions for, especially for private equity, which this is not necessarily unique to women's health, there's just fewer companies that sort of fit that profile, are who is the next buyer of the business, right? Private equity usually will hold the platform for, call it 3 to 5 or 6 years, depending on, which fund it comes into. And so part of it is, if a company is being sold at, has 10 million EBITDA, for example, in this sale, there's a much larger, very, very large pool of private equity buyers that can underwrite that investment profile. There's questions around how are you going to grow EBITDA for the next sale? Is that organic growth? Is that M&A? If it is M&A, what is kind of the actual growth plan? What could be potential tuck-ins to make that underwriting case and for really be able to return capital to investors and meet their minimums. It becomes more challenging if a company is actually quite large. So once you get to the 100 million EBITDA level in this market, it becomes more challenging because, if that gets sold now in 5 years, who do you have to believe will be at the table to then acquire that business that is much larger? There's a much smaller number of the mega cap private equity firms. And historically, you've had more of an eye towards an IPO, right? This market's a lot more challenging. But increasingly, we're seeing that for some of these much larger platforms, there is an interest and almost a necessity to consider a dual track process, right? Where you may consider an IPO exit in parallel or at least prepare it. And at some point, you obviously make a decision, right, before flipping public on the S1. Or to pursue an M&A path, but to give you kind of optionality for an exit and kind of thinking about that next 2 or 3 steps, even after the initial transaction you're working on now, is never been more important. Because if you need to have confidence that you'll be able to have a good outcome on the other side for investors to really come to the table. But a lot of it comes to they have to check the box on TAM, right, and market opportunity. Usually there's a third-party consultant report as part of the process, but reducing risk in areas, as Christina mentioned, as much as possible to just make the underwriting case as likely to get through investment committee as possible, and then a lot of focus on the financial profile kind of what do you have to believe for it to get from point A to point B in the next 3 to 5 years. And mitigating risk along the way, right? Of course, is quite critical. And I think, an important part of my role when I work with private equity and companies is really how do you position the story and the narrative. I think it's actually more important in women's health than almost any other area that I work in. Part of it is because 9 times out of 10 on the other side, it is an investor who this might be the first women's health opportunity they're evaluating, right? They have to build their thesis and understanding. And to your point, it can't only be a woman's inability to reproduce, right? And so showing how there are a number of areas outside of that are it's not just impact, it is a good business case. There are material growth levers, organic and M&A. It is a large population, and not just population being served, but ultimately there's a business model behind that to activate that population, and the company will really make money, right? All of these things kind of have to flow together for it to make sense. But how do you articulate that, position the narrative for the business is actually never been more important. As you think about kind of educating the other side of the table. And sometimes we do that candidly, and more often than not, before you even launch a process, right? You kind of do these pre-marketing, what we call more informal meetings. There's not a set timeline. There's limited information shared at that point, but it allows the investor to start learning more about the opportunity, the market, start them to kind of do some of their work. The company gets feedback, which is actually quite helpful as well, of what areas of diligence are most important for ABC investors, to then making sure you can then go back, aggregate the data of the portfolio operational performance, and make sure you have that ready for when you eventually kind of do come to market and have hopefully a very successful outcome.
Sasha, I think that's such a great perspective on a more advanced later stage company. And I also really appreciate that Anna gave a very specific example in endometriosis in terms of evaluation. I can think of 2 other quick examples more at the early stage. One is an investment that my partner Julie Grant recently made with Westlake Bioventures in the migraine space. And we had great history in migraine. Both Interwest and Canaan invested in Labris. It was actually the deal that brought me to Canaan when I switched firms. And it was one of the first injectable anti-CGRP antibodies for chronic and severe migraine. It was advancing into an area where it's becoming clear that your generic triptans and life cycle extensions and reformulations weren't satisfying the market. And there was a breakthrough understanding in new biology. And so Labris had a very early takeout based on even phase 1 data. The thesis in this new stealth company in migraine is really doing a very rigorous forensic study of the migraine market today and who is breaking through on those injectables for chronic and severe, which prescribers are prescribing them, what is new biology that can help us understand what might be adjunctive or follow on, 3rd, 4th line therapy in migraine. And the team had done a really good job looking at payer longitudinal data and what was happening in the marketplace, as well as patient attitudinal work to understand who is reluctant to potentially injectables, who is adopting. And then they also started thinking about how can we create new indices for value benefit. So it's not just counting the number of headaches and the severity of those headaches, but tying those to pharmacoeconomic and quality of life data so that you're really making a justification for continued preservation of premium pricing in that space. So I think it takes those kinds of wraparounds, really diligent efforts in addition to your competitive landscape. Another one is a founder that I've been informally mentoring that has a really interesting innovation in the long-acting contraceptive space. And contraception is a pretty saturated place where there's a feeling that there's nothing new under the sun. And yet, particularly with a long-acting intrauterine device or implantable device, there are limitations in the marketplace. And with IUDs, that includes the pain on insertion, the length of activity, also the provider technique that's required to do it and who can do it. Does it have to be a gynecologist with a relevant training, or can you push it down to primary care, push it down even to the PA? And so creating a value proposition that is about how does this save time? How does this save money? And how does this expand the market for something that may be seen as a really well-satisfied contraceptive marketplace? Creates, I think, a much more investable story there. And then I would just say, when we're thinking about whether it's a drug or a device, unfortunately, there is a feeling, and it's, I think, supported by data, but certainly the feeling is very strong among the venture community that the FDA is more conservative, bordering on paternalistic when it comes to women's health innovation. So we think a lot about what is the safety evidence that's going to be required in order to push something through. It's amazing. You can cause blindness with erectile dysfunction drugs, but if you cause a sneeze in a woman treating endometriosis, you need to study another 10,000 patients. So we think about that, and then we think very much about innovation in endpoints, biomarkers, surrogate endpoints, or even just building a more robust set of primary and secondary endpoints so you show value to the payer landscape.
Can I just make a quick comment, because Nina picked on something. Sasha, your comments were spot on. Your comments are spot on. I just want to say, maybe just more of a kind of rounding out comment of what you just all heard. It's kind of the role and responsibility of you as company leaders who are driving these innovations forwards. They're not just innovations, they're products. And what's critical in what you heard Sasha and Nina summarize is understanding what's the development path forward, right? And that's what's the development path forward that doesn't just get you to an approved product that's available, but that payers are going to support. And this is a bar that's true for any innovation, right? That's breaking new ground. So I don't want to say women's health anymore, because women's health, unfortunately, if we have to walk in and say, hey, I'm a women's health company, you're probably doomed from the get-go. So don't say you're women's health. Just come in and talk about who's the patient, what's the disease, right? What's the hypothesis, the science-based hypothesis that's the fundamental biology driving, right? The reason why you think you're going to be successful. What's the path to commercialization? What's the payer path, right? These are all important things that you as companies, you really, really own, right? And that storytelling that Sasha articulated, I think, is just so important. And that's the key to getting in. Think about rare diseases. We used to never pay attention to rare diseases, right? Because we never knew and understood any of those diseases. Think about the storytelling that was required there and the fact that the patients were put first in every one of those stories.
WHAM thinks a lot about storytelling, and I'm about to tell you one, actually, because we're about to run out of time. And I apologize, because I would have gone on for another hour, because it's fascinating. But I want to, first of all, thank this amazing group of leaders, and all of them have dared to swim against the current and have reached extraordinary achievements as leaders, investing in the health of women and showing us what the path forward might be. So my story is a fish story. And you might wonder why there's fish swirling on the cover of the report. And it's because fish spend most of their lives in schools, swimming in circles, and become agitated when separated. But why? And who decides in which direction they swim? A school of fish has no single leader. It's a self-organized system, and the fish come together, align, and move as one. Now, venturing into a new investment sector, in our opinion, is a lot like that. It's a lot like exploring unknown ocean currents or the ocean floor. And those who move first often realize the greatest gains, like many of the women you have just heard from. Just as the ocean floor holds vast unexplored territory, we think investing in the health of women holds transformative potential, but only for those, and you see them sitting here, willing to swim beyond the usual currents. So just don't take my word for it. I hope you dive in. I hope you learn more about this amazing opportunity. Support the work of WHAM. Visit our website, whamnow.org, for more information. Thank you so much for joining us, and reach out to any one of these extraordinary women who can give you much more information than I can at this moment, because we're now just about out of time. Thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to our next dialogue, and we will be in touch. All the best.